difficult, in my opinion, than.
Then you were saying the Polish language is a difficult language, Alexander.
It's a difficult language, by the way. Absolutely. Hello. So it's though it has a tremendous literature and some of the finest poetry. I mean, it's got an extraordinary poetry, and the one Polish poet, Adam Mickiewicz, is famous in many places in Russia too. I've seen statues to him there. Always seemed to me that this might be something that might bring Poles and Russians together, is a shared love of literature, because they both possess it. They've got great music too, by the way.
Yeah, they have a statue of Mickiewicz in Krakow in the main square.
Yeah,
really nice statue.
I mean, he's one of the greatest poets in Europe. He's a wonderful poet, by the way. And by the way, if anybody's ever seen Quo Vadis, the famous film with Peter Ustinov and which is made in the 50s, all about Peter in Rome and the persecutions and all that. It's based on a novel which is actually written by a Polish writer, so it's actually quite an amazing novel, by the way.
All right, well, welcome everybody. We are live, and we're happy that you're joining us for a Tuesday live show. We wanted to get a live show in because we're not sure if we'll be able to do a live on Friday. We'll see, but we wanted to definitely get a live show in and talk about what's going on between Poland and the European Union. This is a big story. We actually have a video, Alexander, on this coming out probably maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. We've done a standalone video, a good 30-minute discussion on this topic, but we wanted to do a live because there is a meeting that took place. I don't know if it's still going on, actually, but it did take place between the Polish Prime Minister and the European Union. Angela Merkel, I believe, was also present, as was Ursula von der Leyen. And the Polish Prime Minister gave an incredible speech in front of the EU Parliament as well. It was the EU Parliament, wasn't it, that he gave a speech?
It was absolutely. It's quite fascinating because Ursula also gave a speech to that same session, so you could see the whole confrontation playing out there.
And Ursula's speech was like 5 minutes, and Mickiewicz' speech was around like 30 minutes. He really just Morawiecki. His speech was just incredible. I mean, just an incredible speech, and we got to really tackle this subject because there is a lot of talk, Alexander, about a Polexit, but I don't think that's a real possibility. I think we're just in a phase of negotiations between Poland and the European Union. And I will say that Poland has been, throughout this whole controversy which centers around the judicial reforms of the Law and Justice Party, Poland has been very accommodating to the European Union, has been willing to compromise. And let me zoom it in here. And the European Union has not. No. They've been, with every compromise that Poland has made towards the European Union has wanted more and more and more from Poland. And I think that's the basic roadblock that we're at right now, which is Poland is not in a position, I think, to give anymore. I think they've given enough to the European Union, and it's time for the European Union to find some sort of compromise to at least meet Poland halfway, so to speak. And that's what Angela Merkel is also signaling to the European Union, which is odd to see Angela Merkel telling the European Union, look, meet Poland halfway. Let's find a compromise. So, Alexander, we're going to tackle this subject. A real big hello and welcome to everybody once again, wherever you are in the world. Hello to our moderators. I see that Alan Watson is in the house. Hello, Alan. How are you? And I'm not sure if there are any other moderators in here, but Alan, it is good to have you with us, and we thank you very, very much. And wherever you are in the world, I see Czech Republic, I see Liverpool, I see South Africa and Athens and Amsterdam and Italia, and where else? Netherlands, Florida. Alexander, we have to do a show on Florida as well. Florida versus the Biden White House. I think that would be a great video. And from Sweden, Toronto, Where else? So all over the world, Alexander, people are joining us to listen into what's going to be happening between Poland and the EU. What do you think is going to happen, Alexander? How do you see this playing out?
Well, at the moment, it's the battle between the irresistible force, which is the European Union, and the so far immovable object. And you're quite right. The Poles have gone out of their way to try to be reasonable. They've come to the European Parliament. Their Prime Minister gave, as you said, a long speech there to an exceptionally hostile reception, by the way. The Poles have shown willingness to be flexible, as they would say, on particular issues, on particular points of process, but on the fundamental key issue, which is the supremacy of law, they've so far been unwilling to back down. And they're taking that line for the moment. And it'd be deeply humiliating for them, by the way, if they had to change it. The EU has shown no capacity to compromise whatsoever, and it's shown no capacity to negotiate whatsoever. And we have to understand something about the EU. The EU doesn't negotiate. It never negotiates. It sets out terms and expects the other side to back down. It did that with Ukraine over the European Association Agreement way back in 2013. It's done that with Russia repeatedly on any number of issues, to the point where the Russians now say that there's no point in negotiating with the EU at all, because the EU shows no flexibility or capacity to negotiate. It did that with Britain over Brexit, where it's ended up as a result with the hardest possible Brexit. And of course, it's doing the same with Poland. And the reason this happens is really very simple. It's important first to understand that the EU is an ideological project. It is a project about setting up a centralized superstate. That is why it insists on supremacy of its law over national law. So it can't compromise on that, because were it to do so, it would accept the end of its ideological project, which is what ultimately it is. But there's a second reason, which is perhaps a more practical one, which is, of course, the EU is a conglomerate of different people. I mean, there's all sorts of people who come together and they discuss things with each other in order to reach an agreed position. Now, what that means is that the EU negotiates all the time with itself before it negotiates with someone else. And in that kind of situation, given that it is an ideological project, it is always the hardliners and the ideologues who are able to crystallize, to harden the position on any particular topic. Because, when you try to seek compromise and consensus within the EU, it is those who speak the loudest and most consistent voices who win out. At that point, it becomes impossible to shift from this position, because, of course, it's all been reached by consensus. And as the consensus has been reached, there is no compromise with it when you're negotiating with a third party. That's what the Russians have recently found, for example, with Ukraine. There's been an extraordinary situation, which I've discussed, I think, on Locals in a video I did there, where Merkel and Macron come along and tell Putin one thing about what they're prepared to do over Ukraine, about ways that they will try and negotiate to try and sort out a compromise over the Ukrainian conflict. And then, of course, Ursula von der Leyen and the EU come along and say something completely diametrically opposite. And then the Russians come back and say, what's going on? And the French and the Germans said, we're locked in to the single united EU position. So given that it works in that way, and given that it's ideological, the European Union will never back down. It will never back down because for them, it is an existential issue, and it will not back down because it never backs down anyway. It never negotiates. Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek finance minister, during the financial crisis, he discovered exactly the same thing when he tried to reason with the EU back in 2015. He found that it simply can't be done.
As the UK did as well.
as the UK did.
5 years to get Brexit finished.
Absolutely, absolutely, as the UK did, and it's still doing, because it's still finding that despite the fact that we're now edging steadily towards the hardest imaginable Brexit, the EU shows no capacity to give or reason or negotiate, because that's not what the EU ever does on any topic.
Okay, Merkel. Get into Merkel. Why is she taking this stand? Why does she seem so neutral in this instance?
Right. Well, there's multiple reasons. And the first one, I think, relates to German economic and commercial interests. And Merkel is always somebody who's extremely sensitive to those. She sometimes, it must be said, overridden them. But generally, she doesn't like to annoy the German business community too much, whose support she needs and will continue to need when she looks for her next job. That could be president of Germany. It could be president of the European Council. It could be something. But Merkel certainly is not out of politics. And that needs to be something we all need to bear in mind. So the German business community has many investments in Poland now. If you travel around Germany, if you know German business people, and I do, by the way, you know that many of them have opened factories in Poland to produce subcomponents for German goods. This isn't just the big companies, it's also the medium-sized and small family companies that form the backbone of the German economy. They don't want to see a Polexit or a crisis that might conceivably result in a Polexit, because obviously that would wreak havoc with their supply chains, which of course are already under enormous stress. So they want to see a compromise with Poland. There is another factor, and it's one that, people perhaps outside Germany don't quite fully understand. And that is that for the Germans, or at least for some Germans, particularly Germans of a certain generation, and perhaps also particularly for Germans from the East, and in this instance, on this issue, Merkel is an Eastern German. Having a country on their eastern border, which is not part of the EU, that is independent and entirely separated from Germany, conjures up all sorts of historic nightmares. And that is not, I think, a factor to be underestimated. So the idea of a Polexit, which would mean that Germany no longer has a fellow EU state on its eastern border, would be an extraordinarily difficult thing, especially now, as I said, when Germany has been moving towards trying to consolidate the EU around itself, and is something that many, many German leaders, especially of a particular generation, find exceptionally difficult. And Merkel falls squarely within that class, that category of person. Now, I have to say that there is another generation of German leaders which is coming up now, especially amongst the Greens, but also to some extent the Social Democrats, who I suspect are far less concerned about those things, and who might be prepared to take a much harder line against Poland. The Greens are much less sensitive to concerns, for example, about the German business community. And of course, they don't share the same feelings about the eastern border. On the contrary, they are far more dedicated to making the EU an integrated system, as integrated as possible, so that it can impose their green policies on everybody within the EU system. So that's where I think we stand. It's at the moment Merkel represents or embodies, if you like, a traditional German policy, but I suspect it's one that will end with her.
We've done a lot of videos, Alexander, in the past where we've talked about this dispute between Poland and the European Union. Yeah. The video we did the other day, which will go up in about a day or two on this very topic, we've said the same thing as to the leverage that Poland has and the leverage that the EU has. And we've said many times that the EU really has two tricks up their sleeve when they want to force countries to do things. The first thing they do is, if you are in the euro currency, if you have adopted the euro, then they'll try to squeeze you there, like what they did to Greece and to Cyprus and to other countries that had fiscal difficulties, and the EU wanted to force austerity down their throats. What the EU would do is they would just pretty much cut off the liquidity of those countries, i.e. people would go to the ATMs and there would not be enough cash to take out, or they would have capital controls. The government would have to impose capital controls on the countries because the ECB would just cut off the euro liquidity. Poland is not in that situation. No. Poland has its own currency. So Poland avoids the first tactic that the EU will use in order to squeeze a country. The second tactic that the EU will fall back on, which is what they are going to do, this is exactly what they're going to do, and the Polish prime minister said as much, is that they will try to withhold EU funds, structural funds, or in this case, KUF funds. And that is exactly what they're looking to do. They're telling Poland, we're not going to give you any of the KUF recovery funds, what we've called slush funds, unless you bow down to our dictate. And the Polish prime minister said, no chance. If you guys want to go to war, and he summed it up like that, a type of World War III, bring it on. And I think that is the right approach, because Poland, though those funds would be helpful, and they may be needed in certain sectors of the economy if they're properly spent and not siphoned off, Poland is not in desperate need of those funds. In other words, they're not existential. But what Poland can do to the European Union, I believe, is existential. I think that Poland could actually really hurt the European Union in significant ways if it does continue to hunker down in its position and doesn't budge. And I say that from the standpoint that Poland has already moved much more towards the EU's position. It's tried to be accommodating to the EU. But I agree with the Polish prime minister. Enough is enough. They've come towards the middle and they've tried to work out a solution. It's time for the EU to also come towards the middle. They won't, but they should. But I believe in this war, in this row, Poland has more leverage than the European Union. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do, actually. But of course, that comes down to the question of whether they're prepared to use it and whether the Poles are united in using it. Now, let's just unpack what you've just said. Firstly, I completely agree. Poland is not in the Eurozone. If Poland were in the Eurozone, it would be in a far weaker position, an immeasurably weaker position, because what you said about how the EU used the Eurozone, the position of, say, Greece in the Eurozone, to switch off liquidity to the banks, to stop money going to ATMs and all those sort of things. Well, they've shown they can do that, and no doubt they would do it. And that, to be absolutely clear, would crush an economy, at least in the short term. Now, withholding funds, structural funds, funds from this new slush fund, well, that doesn't have anything like the same effect. It would be difficult. It would be annoying for many people. It might hurt many people in Poland, but it would not crush the economy in the same way that switching off liquidity to the nation's banks would crush the economy. So Poland is in a much stronger position, and of course it does have tools that it can use. And of course, it also has an ally in the form of Viktor Orban in Hungary. And one thing, among the sort of things it could do, for example, is it could start using the veto in an aggressive way at the EU Council and at the level of the Council of Ministers. And if Poland were to start to do that, then very quickly you would see the entire working of the union start to break down. It might find it difficult, for example, to pass a budget, to carry out the basic mechanisms and actions that it needs in order to function. And of course, that was done once before. It was done in the 1960s by Charles de Gaulle, who was then president of France. He aggressively used the veto power in order to assert French interests within what was at that time still the European Economic Community. and he did it very successfully. But here's the difference. De Gaulle was fully in control of France. He was pursuing a policy that was popular and widely supported in France. And he was, of course, also a political colossus. Now, Poland is not in the same situation. I mean, the Polish leadership may include some, very talented and capable political leaders, but they don't have the stature that de Gaulle did. And they don't have a unified Poland behind them. Many Poles in this issue, in this quarrel, would probably support the EU. And there is another tool to the other two that the European Union has, which is specific in some ways to Poland and some other East European countries. And this is the Russian bogeyman. What the EU says to these countries is, look, we protect you from the Russians. If you join the EU so that you wouldn't be absorbed by the Russian bear, if we throw you out, the Russian bear will come and trample all over you and eat you all up. Now, that's nonsense. That has no reality at all. But there are still many people in Poland who believe it. And of course, there are many people in the government who have actually played it up. The present Polish government has played a long game for many years now of being one of the most anti-Russian governments in the EU. And that, of course, means that they're now exposed to the EU argument that, if you don't play along with us, we will abandon you to the Russians. And within Poland, that carries a lot of traction. And the policies that the Polish government has itself followed have, of course, opened it up to that kind of pressure too. So, it's a difficult situation. The Poles have lots of tools they could use. The EU is in a weaker position relative to Poland than certainly it was in relation to Greece. But the Poles may not be prepared to use all those tools in their toolkit and may not be prepared to take the firm stand that they could do for reasons which are primarily psychological.
Yeah, someone in the live stream said that Poland receives around 121 billion from the EU. I'm not sure about that number. Do you know anything about that total funding?
I think that might be true over the entire period that Poland has been receiving funding, and that has been on a simply enormous scale. And if Poland has been an economic success story, by the way, it has to a very great degree been because of the economic and financial support it's received from the West, not just from the EU. And I would add that one of the other things that Poland got when it left communism behind is that all its debts, which had been a serious problem for the Polish communist government in the 1980s. I can remember the story about Polish debt at that time and how it weighed on Poland's economy. That entire debt was simply written off. So Poland was given an enormous amount of assistance. And I can understand entirely why a lot of people in Poland would be extremely nervous and very frightened if that aid was cut off suddenly. But having said that, again, I think it's psychological, because I think Poland is much less dependent on this funding than it used to be. And moreover, I think with the change in the geopolitical and world economic balance, which we have seen since the early 90s, of course, it has far more options than it once did. But psychology gets in the way. It might be very difficult for the Poles, for example, to look for trading partners to the east, given the fears they have of Russia, their sentiments that they're a European country, their loyalty to the West, their feelings of affinity, also, let's not forget, to the United States. So they have lots of cards to play. I don't think they need to worry about a Polexit, actually, because there's no mechanism for the EU to expel them. So they could do what de Gaulle did in the 60s. They could play tough and hard, and they could probably win. But psychologically, it might be very difficult for them to hold together and to do it. And the problem is the Poles might be divided and uncertain, but they're up against an EU combine that is implacable and which will just go on until it gets everything that it wants and more.
Yeah, you know, the Polexit thing actually is something that's being used more by the EU side than the Polish side. Actually, the Polish side is saying, no, we don't want to leave the EU. A Polexit is not in the cards, but it's the EU and the EU's puppet media channels that are spreading the Polexit. You see how sinister the EU is and how sinister their mainstream media channels are, because they're the ones that are spreading the Polexit, because the EU knows one thing, that the Polish society is divided on this issue, and they understand, or at least with the Law and Justice Party, there is a pretty much a 50-50 split, give or take, between support for the law and justice and people that don't support the law and justice in Poland. And the EU understands that. And what the EU is betting on is that if we can push this Polexit narrative out there, then maybe we could get the 50% of society in Poland who aren't too favorable towards the law and justice to start to, you know, get some protests on the squares, get some people out on the streets, get some of the Polish society speaking out against the law and justice, and maybe get that party to come more towards our thinking. They're really trying to split up the society, which is what the EU does very, very well. So the Polexit narrative is something that the EU is using more than the Polish politicians. Actually, the Polish politicians aren't using it at all.
Well, actually, absolutely. It's a completely phony narrative, because Poland will not leave the EU. They've said that very clearly. They have no interest in leaving it. And the EU has no mechanism to expel Poland. So it can't do that. The EU can impose in domestic sanctions against Poland. It can fine Poland. It can, if all the other countries in the EU agree, suspend Poland's rights on the EU Council. But of course, Hungary will support Poland so long as Orbán remains in power. But the reality is, Polexit isn't going to happen. The reason the EU is spreading this story about Polexit is obviously in order to divide Polish society and to conjure up the Russian bogey figure, to say, you know, you'll be thrown out and, you know, the Russians will gobble you up for breakfast because we won't be there to protect you anymore. And it's a fiction. It's a fiction in every respect. Actually, from the EU's perspective, this is a worse challenge to them than Brexit was. And I explain why. Because if the Poles do what they have said they would do, if they stick with this position that their laws are sovereign, or at least their constitution is sovereign over the EU, then of course the EU can't function as a superstate anymore. And sooner or later, other states will start to copy this, and the whole system of uniform law, with the EU imposing its uniform law on nation states, that will crumble. And of course, if Poland goes a step further and it fights back by taking the step that de Gaulle did in the 60s and starts to veto decisions in the EU Council on a regular basis and has the support of Hungary in doing so, then of course that is a much bigger crisis for the EU than Brexit was, because at that point the EU cannot function legally at all. Whereas with Brexit, well, Britain goes, but the rest of the EU continues as it has done before. So you can see that this is, for the EU, a more dangerous outcome. They would prefer, if anything, if Poland did leave, than if it succeeded within the EU and did all the things that the Polish government seems to be threatening: veto things in the EU Council, continue to insist upon the supremacy of its constitution over EU law. So Polexit is impossible. Poles don't want it. EU can't do it. The EU, in theory, has a crisis on its hands, but Polish society is deeply divided, and I'm not sure that they will hold.
It's not really, and the funny thing is that this is not really a crisis. This is the EU making something into a crisis. And why are they making it into a crisis, Alexander? This is because the EU and Ursula von der Leyen, the people who are, pulling the strings of the puppet we call Ursula von der Leyen, they're basically saying, look, we cannot let Poland go this way as far as their judiciary is concerned. Because if their judiciary actually favors their constitution, their sovereign state constitution, then the EU starts moving further away from this centralized superstate, which is not the direction that the globalists want to go. They want a centralized EU superstate. And so that is why they are making this into such a big deal. I mean, if you step back, this is not really a big deal. It's basically Poland saying that, when it comes to our judiciary, our courts, they're going to follow the Polish constitution. Finished. It's logical. Makes sense to me. The Greece should follow the Greek constitution, the German constitution, etc., etc. But the EU is saying, oh crap, wait a minute. If we let Poland get away with this, then maybe other member states will follow. And the worst case scenario for them is that we lose our momentum towards centralization. So we got to make this into a huge deal, because what does the EU want? They want full control of a country's political system. They want control of their judiciary. They already have control of most of the member states' fiscal policy. And eventually they want to move towards some sort of military centralization as well. So this is big for the EU, because if they lose Poland with this situation, as far as the judiciary is concerned, then it means that their centralization plans have kind of, taken a detour for the worst, and they can't have that.
Absolutely. You're entirely right. This is only a crisis if you have an ideological project, which is to centralize everything and create a superstate. If you don't have that ideological project, if you see the EU, or rather, let's not even call it the EU, let's call it the European Community, which of course it was in the 1990s when Poland sought to join. If it's just a community of sovereign states which cooperate and work together on certain issues, trade and policies and such things, well, then, of course, accepting the fact that there are some areas where, you have joint rules and regulations, which is, the European Community's acquis, and other areas which are, of course, the Constitution prevails because these are sovereign states. Well, then there's not a crisis at all. You can easily negotiate. You can find all sorts of ways round. You can easily get a system together which will make it all work and work in a way that everybody accepts and everybody can live with. But of course, that's not the EU that we're talking about. We're talking about something that very much in its own self-conception does perceive itself to be a superstate. And of course, if you are trying to create a superstate, then this is a crisis. This is a rebellion, an insurgency, an uprising by a member state against that very idea. And of course, this is something that might prove contagious. There might be other countries in Eastern Europe. Hungary is the obvious case, but there's Slovakia, the Czech Republic, conceivably not at the moment. They got a pro-EU government now, but other places, well, they might come to and start saying the same thing. They might also say, well, look, on some issues, we insist that our domestic laws and our constitution prevail because we're sovereign countries, and that's what we want to do. We're happy to work with you as part of a community of sovereign states. The Polish Prime Minister used that deadly word, that absolutely unacceptable, abhorrent word as far as the EU is concerned, sovereignty, in that speech he gave to the European Parliament. But if you abhor sovereignty on the part of European states, if you don't feel there should be sovereignty on the part of European states, if you feel that the only sovereignty is the one that belongs at the EU center, because your objective is to create a United States of Europe, but one, by the way, which is much more united than the United States of America is, much more centralized than the United States of America is, well, then, of course, this is a crisis. This is something you must break and suppress at all costs. And you're going to use all the machinery and all the apparatus that you have, which is considerable, in order to smash it. And as I said, on this objective, they are uncompromising, because as ideologues, they're uncompromising on everything.
All right. True or false? Poland would have been in a much stronger position going into this battle with the EU if Trump were president.
Oh, no question.
Trump supported Poland a lot.
Well, of course he would have done. I mean, just as he supported Brexit, but of course he would have done. He would have been out there. He would have been speaking in support of Poland. He might even have gone to Poland, actually. I mean, given his feelings about the EU and his feelings about Poland, I can very easily and very well imagine it. But in a completely different situation. But I mean, without Trump, of course, the Poles don't have that ally. They don't have that friend, because the present administration in Washington very much supports the EU project. It's entirely allied with the EU hardliners on this.
Yeah. Another question, the funds. Let's go back to the funds, Alexander, because a lot of people are always saying that, yeah, but Poland benefited so much from the funds. They got so much money. I kind of say, so what? They got the money. That was part of the deal. But the positive of it was that Poland did get a lot of money from structural funds, but they didn't squander it. For the most part. I'm not saying there's no corruption in Poland, but for the most part, they used those funds wisely. They built up the country. It became a very viable, a good economy. I mean, they really took those funds and they invested them, and they made Poland what it is today. And they used those funds as well to have a very close and unique relationship with German business as well, which is probably one of the reasons they got those funds. I mean, Germany obviously saw the potential as well. So to me, the issue of the funds and what Poland got shouldn't be conflated with this issue of the judiciary. Is that correct or no?
Well, absolutely. But can I just say something? Why were those funds given? Were they given out of charity to Poland? They were given out of charity. They were given in order to achieve a certain objective. They were the Western powers, not just the EU, wanted a strong, prosperous Poland as a barrier against Russia. I can say that straightforwardly, because that was partly what it was all about. So they poured money into Poland, partly for that purpose. And of course, the Germans did very well out of it, because, of course, they developed Poland in a way that, as I said, the German business community was able to open up lots of factories. I know German business people who have opened up factories in Poland. I mean, I know lots of people like that, and use them as part, a place where they could supply subcomponents to the German industrial machine. So that was why it was done. It was done in order to achieve that purpose. And it succeeded. It's made Poland a strong country which stands up to Russia and which provides Germany with all this economic help. But of course, that comes against the other problem, because, of course, you want a Poland that is strong in some respects. You want it to be anti-Russian. You want it to provide subcomponents to Germany. But you don't want it to have a mind of its own when it comes to EU matters. You want it, in other words, to be not a equal partner, but some kind of a servant. So at that point, this money that's given, it wasn't, as I said, ever given for a charitable purpose, but it begins to look increasingly manipulative. And maybe in terms of relations between sovereign states, you should be more realistic. You should say to yourself, well, if you give lots of money to a country and you make a country strong, then you must accept that that country, when it becomes strong, develops its own ideas, as countries do. And, when we talk about Poland's economic recovery after the end of the Cold War, well, they did get an awful lot of help, undoubtedly, from the West. But, Poles themselves played a role in contributing to that also. And let's not forget that.
Yeah, a lot of countries took those funds and they squandered them.
Absolutely.
Poland did not do that for the most part.
I know.
For the most part, they took those funds and they built for the future.
Absolutely.
And we shouldn't forget that. Alexander, Hungary elections coming soon. How do you see Hungary factoring in?
Oh, this is absolutely crucial because the key weapon that the EU has, the one that they're really aching to use, is to suspend either Hungary or Poland's voting rights on the EU Council, at which point they can start passing directives and resolutions which are binding legally on Poland and Hungary, at least so the European Court of Justice is going to say, and the Poles and the Hungarians are in deep crisis. But they can't do that because the Poles and the Hungarians have an understanding that they will support each other at the EU Council. The EU Council needs unanimity. If all the other countries, if there is no unity amongst all the other countries to support Poland's withdrawal of Poland's voting rights, it can't happen. So just as Poland blocks any attempt to strip Hungary of its voting rights on the EU Council, so Hungary blocks any attempts by the European hardliners to strip Poland of its voting rights on the EU Council. If Orban loses the election in April next year, then Poland is desperately exposed. If the Polish government capitulates or falls, then Hungary is desperately, and Orban is desperately exposed. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, this is a fight for sovereignty, Alexander. So I wonder how much of a role Build Back Better plays and the Great Reset plays in all of this. Because if you don't have a lot of centralization, then what you might have happen is as we continue to move with this Build Back Better agenda, which is all over. It's in the US. You see Boris Johnson using it. Biden is using it. As we continue to move towards this globalist agenda, you might have countries in Europe, i.e. Poland, Hungary, who are saying, you know what, if I do X, Y, and Z, this goes against our constitution or our country's human rights. Do you see something like that happening? And is that a reason why Ursula von der Leyen, who is a globalist puppet, why she is panicking to get such control over Poland? Because she may fear, you know what, if we have Poland, if we have Hungary, if we have other countries in the EU start to say, you know, well, I don't really want to mandate X, Y, and Z, and I don't want to make my citizens do A, B, and C, then they can't really, proceed with their Build Back Better agenda. That is something to consider here as well. This may move. This is part of the judiciary as well.
Oh, absolutely. As I said, this is an ideological project, and we focus specifically on the EU and the integrationist ideology that is there. But that integrationist ideology is very much part of the broader globalist ideology, which is, to be very clear, ascendant in the United States, especially with this administration. So if there is a successful rebellion against it within the EU, which in some ways is, if you like, the petri dish, the experimental area where you're doing this at its most extreme, more so, much more so even than the United States, then of course, if that rebellion succeeds, it becomes infectious and others might start to copy it. And instead of using the present crises to accelerate centralization, EU acceleration, European centralization, but also global centralization. That's what globalism is all about. It's both centralizing and at the same time deconstructing. It's a strange mix of things. But if countries start to assert themselves once more as sovereign nations, then it can't work at any level. And the crisis will then start to go in, instead of moving this process of globalization, integration, whatever forward, it will start to reverse, because you will start to see more and more countries saying, well, this isn't working for us. We're going to start to make our own decisions. We're facing a deepening crisis in the economy, in society, in all sorts of fields and areas. We have to be careful what we say here, by the way. But at that point, they might start to make their own decisions, no longer observing the rules laid down for them by either the EU centre in Europe or by the globalist oligarchs, if you like to call them that, who operate as well. So obviously, this is a major crisis. I mean, look at what the American media, the US media, the liberal media, the media that was so critical, of the Republicans, of Donald Trump. Look what they say about Orban. Look whose side they're taking in this quarrel. It's all you have to do is read what they say, and you find that it is identical to what the liberal media is saying in Europe.
Yeah, I find what they say about Orban absolutely disgusting, and it's very insulting to the people of Hungary, to be quite honest, because Orban, like him or not, was elected, I believe, twice.
Yeah.
And he was elected by a considerable margin. He is a very skilled, if nothing else, he is a very skilled politician, and he understands his people. He understands the sentiment that's going on in Hungary, and that is why he wins elections. But what the mainstream media says about him is very disrespectful to the people of Hungary. But that shows the dirty games and the dirty tricks they play. He was elected twice, unlike presidents in certain other countries,
or institutions, or intended super countries.
Yes, exactly, Alexander. But before we get to a couple of super chats, Alexander, a case in point is actually the UK, I think, because the UK finally, after 5-6 years, detached from the European Union, and you could see that Boris Johnson is conflicted. On the one hand, I look at the UK, at some of the decisions that come out of the UK, and I say, okay, now they're following a sovereign path. Yeah. Other times, I look at what's coming out of the Boris Johnson administration. I say, God, this guy has gone full freaking globalist. Yeah. It's hard to figure out exactly where the UK is heading. They got out of the EU, and I was hoping, okay, now the UK is going to chart, sovereigntist path forward. They haven't quite done that, have they?
No, they haven't done it at all, actually. I mean, we have a very confused and chaotic situation in Britain where the government has failed to cohere around a sovereigntist policy. What it does, instead of pursuing a consistent and well thought out and properly planned policy, is it improvises, and at the same time it does declamatory things which I think are unwise, like sending warships into the Black Sea, for example, which I think are wildly misjudged. But perhaps in time things in Britain will sort themselves out. I mean, Britain does have, as I said, one of the interesting things about Britain is that despite many attempts to try and persuade people to change their minds on this, polling data still shows that support for Brexit remains completely solid. There hasn't been any shift of view on this issue at all. And so that might ultimately start to have an effect. But you're absolutely right. The political class, it doesn't so much remain conflicted. You have a few people within the political class, some of them are in government, who remain committed to sovereigntism, sovereigntist policies. And you have another much bigger section of the political class, which feels orphaned, if you like, because they're no longer part of the EU club. They can't really imagine a world outside it. They're hankering to be able to rejoin and to be back in the same club all over again. And they've lost the skill set needed to lead a country well. And that's why Britain is making all the mistakes that it is. Perhaps in time that will change.
Yeah, it is a missed opportunity. Yeah. Because if a lot of countries saw a successful UK really just chartering its own course out of the EU, if a lot of countries in the EU would have said, you know what, I want to do what they're doing. I want to get out of this cage and I want to do what they're doing because they figured it out.
Don't write us off. We're a quirky nation, we don't always do things very well, but sometimes we do get there in the end. And I would say that we're still very much at the beginning of this process. The political class, as I said, is still almost entirely. I mean, it's about, I'd say 85, 90% Remainer and 10% Leaver. But the Leavers are a curious assortment of people. But the important point is to say that the electoral and political base remains solid, and that might cause things to change before very long, as you start to see the political class reshaped by the necessity to make this work. So don't write us off. I agree it's not working terribly well at the moment, but that's often the case with the British.
No, I never write off the British. That's for sure. Never. And I think at the end of the day, they will get there. And I think it will be that example that will spark other countries in the EU to think twice about what the European Union is.
I would add, by the way, that the European Union is doing its absolute best to push Britain away now. I mean, they're not able to negotiate even on the most simple things in any coherent way. And the result is that Britain is taking, as a consequence, it's having to drift towards an ever harder Brexit, which perhaps even most of the leavers in government didn't really want to see. So, the EU is helping this process along in its own strange
They're
way.
sore losers. The people in the EU are plain and simple. They're sore losers, and They think they're going to put they're going to exact some revenge on the UK. They think, we'll make them suffer because we're the all-powerful, EU technocrats and bureaucrats. They tried the same stuff on Greece, and to an extent, it worked. But I think when you're dealing with the UK, you're dealing with a much more powerful and a much bigger opponent, and I don't think it's going to work. I think they're very petty in what they try to do to exact revenge on the people of the UK. It's not going to fly.
Absolutely, I completely agree.
Yeah, let's do some super chats here. And Valley S is in the house moderating as well, and so is Cosmic Rain. Thank you very much for joining us and for moderating. Cosmic Rain also sent the super chat and said, "Sorry I'm late, lads, but better late than never. Keep up the good work as always." Thank you, Cosmic Rain. It is great to have you here, and we appreciate our moderators very, very much. Raul Pinto says, "Warsaw will defend itself with any weapons available." That is a quote from the Polish Prime Minister. Do you think this could lead to civil war in Europe?
No, I don't think it'll lead to civil war exactly, if you mean by fighting, but it could lead to a crisis within the EU system if the Poles remain firm. As I said, their ultimate weapon, if one could put it like that, in a war, this kind of war, would be to exercise their veto power on a systematic basis in the European Council. It has been done before. As I said, it was done by de Gaulle in the 60s. Obviously, at that time, it wasn't the European Union. It was the European Economic Community. The structures were far looser than they are today. There wasn't a formal European Council, for example. Didn't exist. Decisions were made at the level of the Council of Ministers and by leader summits. But de Gaulle used that weapon then, and very effectively. It could be used far more effectively today, and the Poles could do it. But as I said, they need to have that strength of will and unity of purpose to do it, and I'm not sure they do.
Yeah. All right, Bitkong, thank you for that super sticker. Really appreciate it. And Hunger says, in the event of conflict in Ukraine, would Russia annex territory all the way to Odessa, or would Ukraine turn into a client ally state?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not sure, we don't yet know that there's going to be that kind of a conflict in Ukraine. But let's game plan this. The Russians showed in April that they are able to assemble very large forces in eastern Ukraine, on the border of Ukraine, far greater than anything that Ukraine can put together and that NATO can put together. And there's no realistic possibility that NATO would fight for Ukraine. They've already said as much. So let's look at the situation. The only way there would be a war in Ukraine is if Ukraine itself, the political class, started it by launching an attack on the Donbass republics. Russia has said it would defend those republics, so it would intervene. The question is, would the Russians stop at the Donbass republics, or would they move further? Well, if Russia intervenes to protect the Donbass republics, there will be massive sanctions and a vast outcry in the West. There would be disconnections from SWIFT, all those things that the Russians are already prepared for. Given that that is so, why should the Russians stop at the Donbass? Why shouldn't they go all the way to Transnistria, taking in places like Odessa, Nikolaev, Kherson, and all the rest? Now, I'm not saying that's what they would do, but bear in mind that the people in these places might support what the Russians do. The Russians have already said it would be the end of Ukraine. It's possible to see this scenario unfold in that way. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's certainly a possibility.
I agree with you, and I think it'll be very easy for Russia to do that. But can you define taking in? What do you mean taking in Odessa and the Nikolaev and going all the way to Transnistria? Do you mean, like the super chat asked, annexing those into the Russian Federation, or a whole different country altogether being formed?
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, I don't want to speculate or go that far. I strongly suspect. I mean, I get quite a lot of information about what goes sentiments in Odessa, for example. I think a big majority of people in Odessa would probably support that. That's my own personal view. And I suspect the Russians have very good knowledge of what sentiments are. But what kind of political structure would then be created? Whether the Russians would say that this pathological government in Ukraine can't be trusted, and that if it's prepared to attack the Donbass, it's most likely to threaten other Russian-speaking people everywhere else in Ukraine. Russia is committed to protecting them, but it will occupy all these territories, but it won't actually unite them to the Russian Federation. It will continue to respect at least the theory of Ukrainian sovereignty until some kind of negotiation on the new government is achieved. So in other words, the kind of situation we have in the Donbass region at the moment, where Russia doesn't recognize these two breakaway republics, but says that it ultimately wants to see them reunite with Ukraine, or whether it would take another step in which, it holds referendums in these regions, and perhaps they vote to join Russia on the same kind of terms as Crimea did, or perhaps something else. I don't know. But, you can outline scenarios, but in any kind of situation like this, it's perhaps important not to go too far forward, because always events shape outcomes. And that's an important thing to say. I mean, when the protests began in Maidan Square in 2013, it wasn't predictable that the result would be that Crimea would vote to join Russia, and that the parts of the Donbass would want to break away. So I don't want to predict too far what would happen in that kind of situation. But I'm saying again, I don't see what incentive, if there was a war in Ukraine, what actual positive incentive the Russians would have to stop at one particular point rather than go further. Of course, it may be, I mean, I don't speak for the Russians, that their calculations are different, but I don't want to guesstimate what they would do. The capability is there, the opportunity might be there, and I strongly suspect the temptation to do it would be there, and it would be very strong.
All right. Hunger says, all the UK elites had to do was change the definition of Brexit. London was always the center of globalism, exported it to the EU post-World War II, and now look at the monster they've created.
Well, there's a great deal of said of that too. Of course, if you live in Britain, you know very quickly an important fact about Britain, which is that there is London, which is one thing, and that's very much a world city. And there is also the rest of Britain, especially England, which has a very different perspective. Again, many people outside London in England mistrust and feel different sentiments towards London. And if you look at the Brexit referendum, it's striking. London overwhelmingly voted Remain, whilst the rest of England voted Leave. And there you can see the difference. So there's the policies that London has, and that the financial and business institutions and all the people who exist there have in London. And then there is also the sentiments of the wider British, or perhaps I should say English people, which might be completely different. And you're quite right. Globalization is something that London ultimately began it. I mean, London did the first globalization experiment back in the 19th century, and they've created, in a way, this reaction. And one of the reasons for the bitter anger of the Remainer community in Britain is precisely that they're so angry that the English people rebelled against the policy that, in a sense, London itself hatched. And it's an interesting way to see this thing play out.
Yeah. Angel Spawn, 4.99 super chat. Thank you very much, Angel Spawn, for that. And Brando Commando has this comment: sometimes you've got to love Poland and Hungary. They challenge the establishment and are basically the red states of the EU.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's
absolutely.
That's very well put. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you very much.
By the way, I also want to say, I mean, when people talk red states is about right, because of course the way Poland and Hungary are described in some places, I mean, sort of reactionary, all kinds of things. They're not like that at all. I mean, Alex was recently in Poland, and it's a very friendly, very relaxed sort of place. I mean, and it's important to say that the things you read about these countries in the Western media bear little relation to the reality of them.
That's why it's important to go to see, because what you read from the mainstream media is absolute garbage. When you go to Poland, you realize what a fantastic place to is. What a livable place it is. And when I mean livable, I mean it just really is livable. I mean, it's just a nice place to be. So don't believe anything that they're saying, the mainstream media. It's all rubbish, Alexander. All rubbish. From Command Unit, who would you guys like to see as a successor to Putin as president? I think Alexei Dumin, the current governor of the Tula Oblast, is a great candidate.
Lots of people are talking about him. Putin met with him, by the way, quite recently. I mean, he is a distinct possibility. I don't know. I mean, who would I want to see? I've never actually even thought about that. I've never actually said, I want this person instead of that person or whatever, because I've never really given that any particular thought. And I'm not going to say. After all, it's not as if I have any real choice in the matter. I think the person who will become the next leader will emerge as a result of a very careful discussion within the highest levels of the Russian leadership. Putin, of course, will play a key role in that discussion, that he won't be the only person who has made that discussion. And I suspect there have already been soundings already, and Duman is a distinct possibility. If we see him being appointed to a ministerial position within the Russian government, then of course that would definitely be a sign that he is a rising man.
Yeah. Angel Spawn says, what about the Visegrad countries, Czechia, Slovakia, regarding support for Hungary and Poland? Absolutely.
But Slovakia could, and probably would actually, quite possibly might do. The Czech Republic is different. I mean, the previous government, the government led by Babiš, which which is, has just been defeated, but the government's just been defeated in the recent parliamentary election. It, I suspect, would have supported Poland and Hungary in this battle. The new government that is being formed in the Czech Republic as a result of this parliamentary election seems to me to be much more pro-EU, and I doubt that it will. But Slovakia is a different story.
Yeah. Mark Hewitt, you did a show on Sunak and Kwarteng. but the main threat to Boris Johnson is Liz Truss.
Well, she's now the emerging star. She's just become foreign secretary. I don't think she is yet a real rival to Boris, but you never know. I mean, Conservative Party politics are very, very complicated. I mean, the point is, at the moment, Sunak and Kwarteng, as I said, are battling out between them. There's clearly a power struggle going on between the two. If Kwarteng wins or Sunak wins, that will mean that they're in a stronger position with respect to the other. And I don't quite see Liz Truss actually coming to the fore. And I mean, one of the reasons, by the way, is that I think that she has the support of the Thatcherite wing of the Conservative Party, which at the moment doesn't look to be in the ascendant, whereas the sort of more patrician wing, I think, would probably prefer someone like Kwarteng or Sunak, depending on which of the two wins through. So, Conservative politics, I mean, are very complicated. And can I just say, the Kremlin politics are straightforward by comparison.
Yeah. Moon Dragon says, if Poland had good relations with Russia, it could maneuver much more than now.
Absolutely. Alex made a brilliant point in a program we did some time ago, in which he said that this fear of Russia and this hatred that many Poles have towards Russia, because let's be straightforward about it, clouds their judgment. It makes it clouds their clarity. Actually, that was what he said, and it does. It means that they don't see things clearly, and they are frightened. They frighten themselves with ghosts rather than look at the situation today as it actually is. I mean, Russia today is not led by Joseph Stalin or Catherine the Great. It's not out to conquer Poland. Very last thing the Russians want is to conquer Poland. What the Russians want, actually, are good relations with Poland. Putin, by the way, spoke about this a long time in that speech he gave at the Valdai conference just a few days ago. And it would be as big a change in the European system and as positive a change in the European system if Poland and Russia reconciled as it was when Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle came together in the late 50s and early 60s and ended the conflict between Germany and France. And I am confident it will happen. Already, I'm quite familiar with Poland. I can already see that many people in Poland are gradually changing their feelings about this issue. And bear in mind, in Poland and Russia, which are two Slav countries, they know each other very well. They have much in common. You often see actors, for example, from each country starring in the films made in the other country. There's an awful lot of cultural interchange between Poland and Russia. So I think before long, actually, within the next 5-10 years, I think we will see that change. And then, of course, things will change geopolitically as well. And we will see some real signs of stabilization in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. JHW says, in England, we stood with the Poles in 1939, and we stand with them now against the new enemy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That's a nice super chat.
I mean, there's lots of, and indeed, I mean, the British do have great liking for Poland, going all the way back to the 19th century. And of course, they stood with them in 1939. It was a seminal event and a key event in, of course, modern British history. And of course, they stand with them today. You go into the British media, you will find in some sections of the media a lot of sympathy for Poland. In the Leave media, you wouldn't find that at the moment in the Remain media at all. But Polish people are very welcome in Britain. They get on British people get on with them, and no doubt at all, many British people support Poland in this fight.
Yeah. Guy says, if Poland and Hungary acquiesce, what barriers remain to total EU control? Are there any remaining bumps on the road to a European superstate?
Well, if Poland and Hungary acquiesce, they will turbocharge forward with the European superstate. We will see attempts to create united tax systems. And of course, Macron's EU army might suddenly begin to get life. But ultimately, my own personal view is that the underlying structural faults in the system are irresolvable. And what will happen is we will see an even more inflexible and overweening system created, which will eventually crumble. But to be absolutely clear, if they were able to do that, if they're able to grind Poland and Hungary down, it's quite likely that they will too, then this system will get a further lease of life, and it will continue for another 5-10 years and push this thing even further, this superstate idea even further. It will encounter resistance. It will probably encounter resistance from places like Italy, for example, Spain, conceivably, in southern Europe. But always, they're able to keep it going until eventually the whole thing crashes down under its own weight. And it may be that it's situation, conditions in the world economy that will cause the crisis, that will bring it down, bring it down. They ultimately will. I would add that there is one other European country that is outside the system, that is extremely powerful, and in military and I think economic terms getting more so, and which presents them with an insuperable problems. And that, of course, is Russia. And one of the reasons you see them raging at the Russians all the time is because they can't get the Russian problem sorted. And that bump on the road will never go away.
Yeah. From Command Unit, Alexei Duman got a great victory in Tula recently when they overwhelmingly voted for United Russia in the recent Duma elections. He was appointed by Putin to this position, uncommon in recent years.
Well, absolutely. Can I just say something? If again, he's clearly a popular, talented politician. If he's promoted, and Tula, by the way, is an important place. It's right at the center of the Russian military-industrial complex. A lot of the artillery is produced there. It's a major industrial center. It's a technological powerhouse. It's also, by the way, important in cultural terms. It was Leo Tolstoy's home city. And if you go near to Tula, you will find Tolstoy's birthplace. His estate, which is still preserved and by his family. It's still there. It was protected by the Soviets, believe it or not. And it's a place of enormous importance to Russians for all sorts of reasons. So if he's able to make a success of that, if he's popular there, he's going to learn an awful lot about Russia. He's going to have lots of contacts with, as I said, the military people, the scientists, the technologists, the industrialists, all of those sort of people, the intellectuals. That would be a good training ground to become president of Russia. Will he become that? I don't know. But he's certainly someone to watch. And if at some point in the next 4 years, he's appointed to a senior position in Moscow, then definitely he would start to look like the rising man.
Yeah. From Simon Felix Pageo, super sticker, thank you very much for that. And Amarit, super chat, says, Iveco LMV was supplied to the Russian army for use in Syria in 2016 by Italy. They also sold nuclear waste carrier ships to the Russian Navy in 2015. Italy didn't go back on the deals like the French, despite sanctions.
No, of course not. Absolutely not. But I would say that if you go back a bit further to the time before the Crimean crisis, there were some suggestions at that time that the Russians might actually go a lot further and buy armored vehicles from Italy, from Iveco. And there was even talk that they might buy infantry fighting vehicles and APCs for the Russian military. Now, there was a lot of opposition to that within Russia itself. And of course, the Crimean crisis, the Ukrainian crisis made all that impossible. So yes, they didn't go ahead. They didn't block all that in the way that the French did with the Mistral. But it was a lower profile deal. And to be honest, the really big deals that might have been coming never happened. And of course, what's happened instead is that the Russians developed all those vehicles that they might have bought from Italy by themselves.
Yeah. From Hey Man, Brexit and MAGA caused more self-harm than damage to the EU or China. There are ports being built all over the world right now. Why would we isolate ourselves?
Well, I don't think the point about either MAGA or Brexit was about isolation. At least not for many of the people who voted for these things. I think they didn't want to isolate themselves. What they wanted, on the contrary, was to trade freely in the kind of way that these countries had traded before. In other words, for Britain not to be tied down all the time by the EU trade policy, which, can I stress, is highly protectionist in many ways, but actually engage, as it used to do, specifically in the international trading system, be an active player in places like Asia, the Pacific region, wherever, in ways that it once was, rebuild its economic links with former Commonwealth countries, do things in other words, which were more difficult to do as part of the EU. It was, if you like, an outward-looking thing, because, of course, the EU, as it's been created, has increasingly become an inward-looking trading, commercial and economic bloc. The United States is different. I think in the United States, you have a far bigger continental-sized economy. Trade with the rest of the world is less important for the United States than it is for Britain. But again, I don't think the United States ever was looking to pursue a policy of, breaking contacts with the rest of the world. And I would add that anyway, the policy of the United States between roughly the 1860s and the 1950s was protectionist, and it was the route, if you like, to the build-up of American industrial power. But anyway, Britain and the United States are different. I don't think they've done self-damage or self-harm. I think if you compare the economic results in the United States of the previous administration with the existing one, the situation is much worse this time than it was with the previous administration. And with Brexit, anyway, as I said, I think that idea is wrong. I don't think, as I said, it was a case of looking in. I think it was a case of looking out and perhaps pursuing economic policies and trade policies which would have been more advantageous to Britain than the ones in which it was locked into as part of the EU system.
Yeah. Bitcon says, why didn't the UK let the independent journalist Raphael Zimkevich enter the UK a few weeks ago, who pushed to cancel his table at a restaurant he wanted to eat a few years ago?
Well, I don't know. I to be straightforward about this, I don't know enough about this story to really be able to comment on it. I should say that when it comes to journalists, I'm much more absorbed at the moment with two other journalists, both British. One is Craig Murray, who is a personal friend. Earlier this morning, I was writing a letter to him. He's in prison, and I was handwriting this letter. And if you know how bad my eyesight is, you will know how difficult that is for me. And that gives you a sign of how strongly I feel about his imprisonment. And of course, the other prisoner, the other journalist, a much greater journalist than any of the ones we've discussed, who is in prison in Belmarsh, Julian Assange. His hearing starts, I think, tomorrow or on Thursday. And I've been having to spend a great deal of time covering that. It's taken up an enormous amount of my time, I should say, talking to various people and keeping on track of all of that. And that's going to be an enormously important event. And for me, to be straightforward about it, at the moment, when I talk about rights of journalists and concerns for journalists, it's those two that are uppermost in my mind.
All right, thank you for that super chat. Raul Pinto says, Marine Le Pen honored to meet Orbán to discuss the future of Europe, the control of our borders, and the civilizational challenges. That's a quote. Any thoughts?
Well, she should have done this months ago. I mean, she'd done this back in the summer when she was forging ahead in the opinion polls. It would have looked like a strong play, and it would have gone down well with a lot of people in France. Obviously, lots of other people would have furiously criticized her for it, and it might have given her campaign a further lift. Now, of course, she's struggling. Eric Zemmour is making a big challenge. So her going to see Orban doesn't have the traction that it might once have done. And this is a huge missed opportunity for her. It shows that she's now tactically adjusting hard. She's trying to sort of recapture some of that drive that she once had. But whether she'll be able to do it is another matter. I think she's left it too late, and I think she's done herself an enormous amount of damage, and I think it might be irreparable.
Yeah, Rich says Germany World War II apology includes a 95% apology for the Holocaust, 4% for the rest of the West. Russia isn't on their list, which had most casualties. Comparably, Japan and Italy did a better apology by helping Korea, China, and Libya.
Well, I think the Germans at the moment, I think this isn't completely true about Russia, by the way. I think for a very, very long time, the Germans were very concerned about Russia and about the relations with Russia and about what happened. And, you used to meet lots of people in Germany who was fought there and knew all about Russia, were very scarred and horrified by the experience, and were determined that there shouldn't be a war, and went out of their way to forge close and friendly relations with Russia. Unfortunately, that generation is dying. I mean, they're leaving the scene. They're departing the scene. And the new generation in Germany of political figures, which is rising, knows very little about this at all, and have been steeped in Atlanticist rhetoric and have a completely different view. And of course, Atlanticist rhetoric does give lots of attention to the Holocaust, but to the Russian war, to the Soviet war, it gives practically none.
Yeah. Let's see here. Rich says if it's not Huawei, it's Xiaomi that's leading the world mobile market, second in sales ahead of Apple. The dragon strikes back.
Well, I mean, I went to China, as I said, this was back in 2017, and it's very difficult not to be tremendously impressed by the sheer scale of that economy and its tremendous economic activity. And of course, no doubt at all, if one company fails, there's another which will rise to take its place. In an economy that size, that's likely to happen. That's not to deny that they haven't got economic problems. They do, but that is the reality. They do have that enormous economic resilience, and I don't think some people perhaps fully acknowledge this. Now, I don't know very much about this particular company that's rising. I don't know why it's rising. I don't know the backstory.
Xiaomi, I'm sure you've seen Xiaomi stores. They actually they actually have the Mi, so they're popping up everywhere. Yeah,
they're popping up everywhere. So there we go.
Yeah, they make good handsets.
Absolutely, wasn't it the Pentagon AI person who said that he's given up because the Chinese are so far ahead? I don't believe that, but I believe the US has all the scientists and technologists and people like that to compete very well against the Chinese if they were organized properly. This bunch who are in charge in Washington now couldn't organize, as we say in Britain, a piss take in a brewery. So the chances of them being able to...
Come on. Joe Biden, really? Come on.
I know. So
you're in good hands with Joe.
Absolutely.
All right. Where are we here? Rich says Iveco Centauro 2 is the only 120 mm tank in the world on wheels. Yeah. Italian engineering at its best.
Indeed. And the Russians, as I well remember, actually sent a whole team and they inspected it. And there was some talk that they might want to buy it, modified for Russian purposes. But of course, that became impossible because of the Ukraine crisis, and now the Russians have developed a very similar vehicle in some ways called a boomerang, which is going to have a 125 millimeter gun. So I mean, that's what happens. So I mean, that was an opportunity that Italy lost. I would say it was very controversial in Russia. Obviously, there were all sorts of people who say, why should we buy a product like that in Italy when we can make something like that ourselves? But, that market opportunity was there. I remember it. It was never translated into a real deal, even though, as I said, I can remember when the Russian military delegation went and inspected it.
Yeah, Sparky says, careful, if you keep doing such good reporting and commentary, the dream of a borderless world run by a central authority will not come to fruition.
Well,
let's hope. Let's hope, Sparky.
Let's hope. I mean, I've got the champagne and the waiting for that day. Let's put it like that.
Thank you very much, Sparky, for that. And Anatoly says, if the winter is cold, what can we expect in the European Union?
Oh, lights going out, shutdowns, all sorts of things. There was a lot of dismay.
High energy bills.
Very, very high energy bills. Well, we were already getting them.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly. I mean, my latest energy bill was significantly higher, and that's only the start of it. So we're going to have a difficult winter if it is cold. We don't know whether it is cold. Kwasi Kwarteng, business secretary, has told us that we can look forward to a warm winter. So maybe he knows more than we do.
Let's see. From Command Unit, comparing propaganda of Putin to reality is funny, and the fact that Putin actually gains support from his propaganda is even more funny.
Well, there you go.
There you go. Super chat there from Command Unit. Simon Ennifer says, the COP26, the longest suicide note in history? ? Pray for a cold winter to kill the globalist Green New Deal, as we were just saying about warm and cold winters.
Well, indeed. COP26 is turning into a total debacle for the British. I mean, I've just done a program about this, which will appear on my channel fairly long. But, they had this telephone call. Boris Johnson actually telephoned Vladimir Putin. Something it's hardly been commented on in Britain. You wouldn't know it had happened because the British have this boycott of any contacts with the Russians. But it's obvious that he was trying to get Putin to come to COP26. And Putin has said, no, he's not going. And Xi Jinping has said, no, he's not going. So it's going to happen without two of the most important leaders in the world there. And this is supposed to be a leaders' summit. So it's already looking like a debacle. And the British are very, very bitter about this. But, they brought it on themselves.
Yeah, it's going to be the EU and Canada and the US at the end of the day.
Absolutely, it always is, though. I mean, let's be fair. I mean, that's the other reason why the Chinese and the Russians probably wouldn't want to be there.
Why should they go? Yeah.
Why should they go? I mean, all that happens is that the Americans and the Europeans decide everything, and then demand that everybody signs up to what they've agreed. So there it is.
No need to go. Let's see. Yeah, from Leafy Bug on locals. I broadly understand the historical antecedents that explain the existence of the EU. I do not understand how the EU structures have come to be so rigid. It fails over and over again. It is drifting ever further away from the ever closer union with each failure. It is in a positive feedback loop that will inevitably result in disintegration. I cannot believe that senior EU leaders don't see this, yet they don't change. Why?
Oh, they don't see it. They do. Well, money plays a huge role. Power plays another. Ideology plays a third. The big moment, the decisive thing that changed everything was the decision in the 1980s to push for economic and monetary union. The precursor was a decision that was made back in the 1970s by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was the president of France, and Helmut Schmidt of Germany, to create the system, the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, basically to tie in all the European currencies to each other. And that already created big rigidities, but it was capable of being adjusted. But when they decided in the 1980s to create a single currency, that changed everything. Margaret Thatcher understood it, and she opposed it, and opposed it furiously. But of course, she was overridden. And in one of the first Remainer coups, this was before Remain came along, she was removed from office precisely because she was opposed to economic and monetary union. And from that moment, the train has been trundling towards the abyss with ever greater speed, and it's very difficult to turn it back or to get it off the train lines that it's locked into.
Yeah, Leafy Bug also says, I wonder if the Germans will reach a point where they realize the drawbacks of being in a club are greater than the benefits. That truly would be the end of the EU. Yeah, Germany.
When it's a while since I've been in Germany, I think more Germans are understanding this. When I was in Germany a couple of years ago, I mean, everybody was grumbling about zero interest rates, for example. And of course, the inflation in Germany is now rising, and that's also creating many problems. But the problem is that along with all that dissatisfaction, there is incoherence about politics, because Germans again have all this very strange. It's not strange at all, German history, but they have all these hang-ups and issues left over from Germany's past. So though they are becoming increasingly disaffected, that disaffection takes the form of turning to parties like the Greens. We're going to take this process a whole stage further. It's seen by many Germans as the anti-establishment thing to do, without, of course, realizing or understanding that the Greens, to a great extent, are the establishment. But exactly the same thing happened in France some years ago, when again already it was clear that people were becoming very disaffected with Sarkozy, Hollande, all that style of politics. So they were persuaded to vote for Macron, who was held up to them as the outsider, whereas in fact he was the ultimate insider. And it didn't take very much to understand that. But again, out of sheer bloody mindedness, people just refuse to see it. And that's still the case in Germany at the moment. Eventually, I think the penny will drop. But of course, at that point, it'll be, I think we're not quite there yet. And it'll be very turbulent when it does.
Yeah. Cromer says, speaking of Thatcher, what do you guys think about the often talked about role that Thatcher played in liberalism's rise?
Well, I should say this. I mean, I remember Margaret Thatcher extremely well. I mean, she was in many ways a very impressive and a very powerful political figure. She, dominated politics in Britain. She had a very big effect internationally. I was very critical of her at the time. I am very critical of her still. I'm far from being, a complete, somebody who's not blind to her many mistakes and to all of the things that she did. I don't, at the same time, in any way dispute or distract her huge importance as a political figure and as somebody who made huge change to Britain, much of it positive, some of it negative. There's no doubt at all that she did unleash forces in Britain and elsewhere, which did help to assist in this process of globalization that we have seen. She herself, I think, towards the end of her premiership, came to understand this, or at least to sense it. And as I said, she was trying to shift policy in a different direction. But by that point, the very globalist forces that she had herself, without, I think, intending to, partly assisted, had become so strong that she found that she couldn't really prevail against them. So it's a fact. It is a complicated personality, a fascinating personality, far and away the most powerful British Prime Minister of my time, a real leader in many ways, but somebody who was flawed and somebody who made mistakes, as all human beings do.
Yeah. Flying Boar, update on German political situation.
Well, to be entirely frank, I haven't actually been following
It's
Germany.
pretty calm right now, is it?
Calm. I was going to
I
say,
haven't seen.
as I haven't been following it very closely. I gather that the Free Democrats, that's the Liberals, and the Greens have been talking to each other, and they're going about the gradual process, as they always do in Germany, of forming their coalition. I presume there will be a coalition sorted out before long. The other big news from Germany is that the head of the Bundesbank has resigned, and he was a known fiscal and monetary hardliner, one of the last people left in Europe who opposed, if you like, all these monetary easing experiments. So he's gone. And I do wonder whether the person who takes his place is going to be much more willing to indulge in monetary experiments and in quantitative easing and in fiscal pooling than he was. In which case, I'm afraid we're going to see the whole process of EU integration turbocharged even more. Won't be popular with many Germans, however.
Yeah. Kurt Franz says Switzerland will decide on KUFA rules in November. So far, many are on the street every weekend in Bern. Great video on this, Alex. Yeah, a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
In
I saw it
Switzerland.
too.
It was
impressive.
Impressive.
I was watching Alex's video about this. You can find it on Locals. Go there. It's
absolutely.
You can see
it is.
Yeah.
It is all on Locals. You will see it there, and it was an impressive turnout. Thank you, Kurt, for that. Anatoly says, anything new on Sudan?
Oh well, we've just done a program about this. I haven't heard very much.
It's holding,
but it's
holding. Yeah,
the coup is holding. I've been reading a bit more since we did that program, by the way, and it looks as if the coup, the military, are getting some support from the Egyptian government also, and that's also and that this military leadership is also hostile to Ethiopia and is siding with Egypt over the Blue Nile Dam. So things to watch out and keep an eye on. But at the moment, it looks as if this is holding.
Yeah. Hunger says, what are your thoughts on Peter Hitchens and the abolition of Britain?
I haven't. If this is a new article or a book by him, I haven't read it. But Peter Hitchens is somebody. I met him, by the way. I don't know him, but I met him in a few venues, and he's a very impressive writer, and certainly one of the few people left in Britain who's able to write in the way that he does. Get it? I don't agree with him on everything, but his comments about politics in Britain have always been extremely insightful. He is, for those who don't know him, a paleo-conservative, and he is very much like Patrick Buchanan. I mean, he's the British equivalent of Patrick Buchanan.
Well said. Simon Ennifer says, COP and ESG mandates enshrine high energy prices and inflation. Without cheap energy, civilizations die. Well said.
Well, yes.
I think we can all support cheap energy prices, right, Alexander?
Absolutely. Yeah. Of course we can.
Boy, that COP meeting is going to be something. It is going to be something. From Triumph, Europe since the end of the Second World War are nothing more than satrap republics, and EU without Russia. Seriously, ask when the America military is going home.
Well, I think you're making an absolutely valid point. I mean, Europe has been, for so much of its history, I mean, all the way going back, to the Roman Empire, and then, of course, there was the Dark Ages, but then, of course, Europe got itself together again. I mean, it was one of the great cockpits of world civilization. It produced extraordinary leaders and incredible culture. Look at it now. Have you ever seen a Europe as mediocre as the Europe we have today? The quality of political leadership is abysmal. And if I could say it straightforwardly, I mean, the culture that's produced in Europe today, I mean, where are the great artists, great musicians and philosophers and thinkers and scientists that Europe used to produce? I mean, compare the Europe of, say, 1950 or 1960 with the Europe of today, and you see what EU integration does.
Yeah, well said. And we'll do one more super chat from Amrit. The U.S. thinks that they can strangle China by holding semicon equipment and underestimate China industry and tech. Also, small firms initially are world leaders in such systems and can supply without coming under radar.
Well, the Chinese economy has enormous critical mass, and it can adjust to industrial and economic challenges very quickly. That, of course, always depends, and with every economy, it depends on the stability of the financial system. And the one thing that John Maynard Keynes was absolutely right about, he was right about many things, he was wrong about many things. But one thing he did absolutely grasp is that the central core of an economy, the absolute basis of everything, is the health of the financial system. Now, there's been some issues, some questions about the health of China's financial system. I personally think that they will get through their current problems. They're going through a very turbulent and difficult patch at the moment, but I think they will be able to get through them and do so efficiently, and they have all that industrial and economic strength as well. But that's not to say that they don't have problems. Do they have bigger problems than we do in the West? I doubt it. And their leadership looks purposeful and strong, and ours doesn't. And that's the big difference.
Yeah. Update on Syria, Alexander. Still got some more super chats left. Update on Syria.
Lots of diplomacy going on at the moment. King of Jordan talks to Assad. The various intelligence officers of lots of Arab countries have been going to Syria. Embassies are being reopened there. There's been a steady move to rehabilitate Syria and to bring it back into the Arab fold. And with that, a growing sense that the war is ending and that trying to keep it going is a huge mistake. And also growing weariness about the war in Turkey. I've been seeing some of the opinion polling data, and it seems even most people in Erdogan's party who support Erdogan's party now think that Erdogan should end the war and that there is really nothing further to be achieved, and growing resentments on the refugees from Syria that are still in Turkey. So I think that, and in the Idlib province as well, steady gains by the Syrian army at the expense of the jihadi fighters who are still clinging on there with Turkish help. I expect that within a fairly short time, we're going to see this war finally end. So I think we are now very much at the end game.
Simon Ennifer says 65% of U.S. Russell 3000 companies have negative earnings, highest ever level. The U.S. is already in recession.
Well, I agree with
that. The U.S. appears to be in recession.
By the way, I agree with that too. We were talking about 8% growth at the beginning of this year, and we've ended up with the U.S. in recession. I mean,
it's in recession.
It's a brilliant achievement. I mean, you take an economy that was growing and you smash it in a few months. I mean, it's just unbelievable, actually.
I wonder if they can withstand 3 more years of this guy. Anyway, flying boar. In 2014, when Russia was down and wounded, everyone in the West poured salt in her wounds. But Russia got up and fought back, and look where they are compared to the EU and West. Remember when Putin went to that G20 meeting and they put him at a table to sit like in the corner?
Yeah.
Remember that?
I know.
And the West was laughing about that.
Oh. I know, absolutely.
Big mistake.
But it was a huge mistake. And of course, to talk about the geopolitics of it, yes, Russia is back, and it's also conducting now not just joint exercises with the Chinese, but they're actually sending joint fleets on patrol with the Chinese. I mean, that wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have been in that situation if the situation with Russia had been handled in a more sensible way.
Yeah.
You end up with Ukraine, you destroy Ukraine, and you lose Russia. It's what a mess.
We'll leave it on this final thought from Simon. Alex, the last super chat is important. Atlanta Fed is now indicating the U.S. is heading into a recession. We'll have to do a video on this, Alexander. Perhaps some more detailed video on this. Simon, thank you for that.
Yeah. Simon, indeed. Thank you very much. And it's good to hear from you also, Simon. And your comments are always so insightful.
It is in a recession.
I agree. I think it is in recession. By the way, just to say, I think China may also be in recession at the moment, though it's more difficult to read the numbers there. But it is the US that you really want to really look at, and they're in denial. I mean, the people in charge in Washington are in total denial about it.
Yeah, Simon says in a super chat, the US and China will be in recession by 2021. We'll have to cover this in a video. I think it's a good video, maybe a two-parter.
Absolutely.
Because the US definitely is in recession. China, is a little harder to figure out, I guess. Yeah. And Rich says, what is the YSEE Hellenic religion organization in Greece? Is it supported widely?
I've never heard of it. Alex, who has more up to date with these things,
YSEE Hellenic religion organization. I don't know, Amrit, but I'll look it up.
No, exactly. But I've never heard of it. That's all I can say about it.
And Simon says, Alexander, you are reading my mind.
Yeah.
All right, we'll definitely do a video on that. The recession, I think, is an interesting topic to explore. Thank you to everyone that joined us for this live stream. Thank you to everyone in locals. Great chat taking place in locals. Thank you to everyone here on the live stream. Great chat taking place here. Our moderators, Valley S. We got Alan in the house. GEC 812 is also in the house. Thank you very much. As is Recklin Abandon and Cosmic Rain. And did I miss anybody? Did I miss anybody that was moderating? I hope not. If I did miss someone, please forgive me. I know not what I do. As Brian Adams, the great Brian Adams says. Alexander, we will leave it there. Do you like Brian Adams?
Oh, absolutely.
There we go. We will leave it there. We've covered a lot of topics on this live chat, much more than just the Polish EU.
Absolutely.
Row, Alexander. So it was a good live stream. Thank you to everyone, and have a great Tuesday. And we have, what are the videos we have coming out? We have one on Turkey coming out, Alexander. We have another one on the EU and Poland. And we've got a lot of great shows planned to round out the week. So thank you, everybody. And have a great day. Take care.
Absolutely.
And any final words, Alexander? Any final words?
No, I mean, it was a fantastic live. And as I said, you talk about the US, bad things there. You talk about China, bad things there. But the European Union is just worse than bad.
It's all a mess. It's all a mess. Oh, God. Oh boy. Let's see. Simon says, what was Biden doing at that CNN town hall? Was he blanking himself in the CNN town hall? It was a jetpack, Simon. It was a jetpack. It was, that's what Newsweek says. I don't know. No. I don't know what he was doing, to be quite honest. Okay. We'll leave it there. Take care, everybody.